team. That's all that matters. You decide that this team is going to determine whether or not you're in a good mood or a bad mood while they're playing. You give these, whatever sport it is, you give those men that authority in your life to make you happy or sad. When your team is doing great, life is incredible. Every day is amazing. Nothing is bad. But when your team's bad, life is pointless. There's no such thing as a good day. And yet even when your team is terrible for years, Browns fans, there's still a part of you that in no way, shape, or form are you ever even considering the idea of abandoning them for a better team. It doesn't matter how bad they are, you're going to keep rooting for them. Never mind the fact that next season, the players that are on the team right now, many of them won't be on the team next year through things like or the transfer portal or for free agency or registering for the draft, whatever. Those players may not be the same. The only thing that remains consistent year in and year out is your love for that team. And because you love that team, that means that automatically there is at least one certain team that you hate with every fiber of your being. There's nothing quite like a sports rivalry. Even if you're not a fan of either team playing, there's still a compulsion for the sports fan to watch those rivalry games, to see as these two teams try to best each other, to see who is the better team today. Rivalry games are some of the most fun that you'll ever have. You'll talk about certain rivalry games for years to come afterwards. You'll keep track of how long it's been that your team has beaten your rival team. You'll mark the days since they were able to beat you. Rivalry games create so much fun. They create so much excitement. They create so much energy around them that there is just nothing quite like it. Packers and Bears. Lakers and Celtics. Ohio State and Michigan. That team up north. I'm learning. We're getting there. We're getting there. But if there's something that's almost as much fun as a rivalry, it's got to be the idea of a budding rivalry. As two teams are both basically on the ascent at the same time, and they're both competing very well, and they both look like they could be winners this year, and they're on an inevitable collision course with one another. That's such an exciting time. And right now in the NFL, we're kind of seeing that in the AFC conference. We're seeing something that's an even bigger rarity in sports. We're seeing a three-way rivalry. For the past 5 or 6 seasons, there have been 3 teams who have consistently been at the top of the AFC. In all 5 years or so, any of those 3 teams could go to the Super Bowl representing the AFC conference. The Kansas City Chiefs, go ahead and get it out of your way. Yeah. The Baltimore Ravens, and the Buffalo Bills. That was the most unenthusiastic yay I've ever heard. I love it. All 3 of those teams have got everything that you need to win a title. They've got a dynamic franchise quarterback. They've got explosive offensive. They've got the ability to run up the score and create memories that will live forever in a sports fan's heart. This past season, we saw just kind of a perfect storm. As in the divisional round of the NFL playoffs, 2 of those teams were competing against each other for a chance to go and face the third, as the Baltimore Ravens clashed with the Buffalo Bills. It was a great game. If you saw that game, it was fantastic. It was neck and neck almost the entire way through. It was anybody's guess as to who was going to win. It was a snow game, which for some reason in the lore of football just makes it even cooler, right? This game was tight all the way through until the last 2 minutes as Baltimore Ravens had the ball down by 8 points. They needed to score a touchdown and convert a 2-point conversion just to stay alive. And with 1 minute and 33 seconds left in the game, Lamar Jackson found Isaiah Likely for a 24-yard touchdown to bring that score to 27. All they needed to do was convert that 2-point conversion. They could send the game into overtime if their defense was able to stop Josh Allen. And everything would work out just fine. Their chances for continuing on in the playoffs were still alive. Every fan in Buffalo there was holding their breath as Lamar Jackson hiked the ball, rolled out to the right, and found a wide open Mark Andrews, perfect spiral right into his hands, only for him to drop it. The game, the playoffs, the season for the Baltimore Ravens hit the ground. They lost their opportunity of overtime and fighting for a chance to play yet another game. Favored team to go all the way to the Super Bowl this season. But because of one drop pass, all of it was over. It's kind of an anticlimactic way for such a great game to come to an end. And Ravens fans, as you might expect, weren't real happy with the outcome of that game. Many of them were not happy with Mr. Andrews dropping what is a gimme ball. Anybody could have caught that game ball right there. And unfortunately, some of those Raven fans decided to vent their frustration with Mr. Andrews online. And some of them got to the point of threatening Mark Andrews' life and the life of his family. Understand, the man was already upset, right? He just let his whole team down. He had just let a whole city down. And now, online, people are literally calling for his head. Upset. He was distraught. And in fact, he didn't make a public address for days afterwards. All while Baltimore Ravens fans continued to pile on him, saying some mean, hurtful, and vicious things about him. And that's when a group of Bills fans who benefited from Mark Andrews dropping that pass, fans whose team got to go on and live another week. Unfortunately, the refs made sure they didn't go to the Super Bowl, but Bills fans who benefited from that drop pass decided that they wanted to do something to lift Mark Andrews' spirits. A guy who literally on Sunday, they were rooting for him to lose. They were ecstatic when he dropped that pass, are now starting to see how Mark Andrews was being attacked online, and they decided that wasn't okay with them. Spirits. And so an online group of Bills fans came together, and they started a GoFundMe. The GoFundMe was an effort to raise money for a charity that works with type 1 diabetes. Mark Andrews suffers from type 1 diabetes. And so they wanted to make this donation in his name as just a way to provide a little bit of encouragement for this guy who, up until this past week, was a fierce rival to them. So they decided to raise this goal. They set it out as $5,000 for this charity. A high goal for sure, but an attainable one to be sure. But last time I checked, they not only shattered that goal, they left it in the dust without looking back as they raised over $100,000. All in the name of a rival that each one of them normally couldn't stand. Not only did they donate their money, but a lot of Bills fans added notes of heartfelt encouragement and appreciation and love even for Mark Andrews. Mark Andrews himself was so overwhelmed by their generosity that when he did make his public statement, he said, and I quote, "Even when the moment seems darkest, perspective can reveal there is still a lot of light in the world." It would be fairly apt, and I would even say appropriate, to call those Bills fans who decided to lift the spirits of a rival as a good Samaritan. It's something that they didn't need to do. They had no reason whatsoever to be able to make this donation and to do so with such generosity. But they saw somebody who was hurting, who was struggling, who was facing all kinds of attack that was really unwarranted. And they decided to step in and do something to try to help lift his spirits. The parable of the Good Samaritan is one that we are all keenly aware of. It is something that has actually gone on outside the life of the church itself. And let's be honest, no self-respecting series on service would be complete without at least one sermon on the Good Samaritan. So we're familiar with this. We know the ins and outs. We know the players of this particular story. But let me ask you this. Do you understand just how shocking that story really is? do you understand how surprising the story of the Good Samaritan would actually have been? Because I can tell you, for those who listened to Jesus as he laid this parable out the first time, it was a shocking and surprising and an unexpected idea of watching as this person that nobody would have expected to be the hero of the story step up and serve in such dramatic fashion. We find this well-loved parable in Luke chapter 10, verses 25 through 37. So if you got your Bible or you got your app, let's open up to it. Let's dive a little deeper and read this all-familiar story. I love that sound. I just do. It fills your pastor's heart with joy. Luke chapter 10, starting in verse 25. Here's what it says. And behold, a lawyer stood up and put him to the test, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? He said to him, What is written in the law? How do you read it? And he answered, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, You have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live. But he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, And who is my neighbor? Jesus replied, A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers, who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. And then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back. Think, proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers. He said to him, The one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said to him, You go and do likewise. Now again, chances are better than good that you at least have a very loose idea of what that parable says. I don't think that any part of that was anything new for most of you in this room at least. But there are a couple of things that we need to unpack whenever we are talking about parables. Whenever we read a parable of Jesus in particular, we need to ask ourselves a couple of questions. We need to keep a couple of things in mind. The first thing that we got to keep in mind whenever we're talking about a parable is to remember what a parable is meant to be. It is a story, it is a narrative that is meant to either teach a specific point or to instruct us about something intangible using tangible means. Does that make sense? So you take something that everybody would know to teach them about something that they don't yet. Or you would use this story to tell a point, to tell a narrative, to tell a specific moral point of what you're trying to get accomplished. The second thing that we need to keep in mind whenever we're talking about parables is we have to ask the question, why? Why is this particular parable being told? See, oftentimes, not every time, but oftentimes as we read through the Gospels, across the parable of Jesus, that parable is usually in response to something going on around him. Jesus is teaching and instructing and will oftentimes use these parables to further teach and instruct, to kind of drive his points. The same reason why you'll hear a lot of preachers, myself included, sometimes tell stories to kind of relate to what's going on about what we're talking about that particular Sunday. And so when Jesus would tell a parable, it's a good idea for us as the readers of those parables to ask ourselves, why is this particular parable being told? And fortunately, Luke, our good buddy, he's maybe my favorite gospel writer because he is just so giving. He tells us exactly why it is that Jesus is telling this parable. This parable is in response to a question. And we see that question in our first verse that we talked about. It says this, and behold is such a great word, isn't it? It needs to make a comeback. Behold, I have made nachos. Love it. Anyway, and behold, I love it. A lawyer stood up to put him to the test, saying, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" So this entire thing gets started with the answer, or with a guy asking a question that Jesus has already answered before. And it's a question he's going to go on to answer again. It all begins with that question. And I love how Jesus reacts to this. Like, at a certain point, as somebody who's taught the same thing over and over again, you got to reach a point where you're just like, this one again? And so instead, Jesus decides to turn it on its head. And he asks the guy, well, what do you think you have to do to inherit eternal life? How do you read the law? And so the guy tells him the answer: love God, love people. And Jesus is like, yep, you got it. Thinking maybe we can move on. But the lawyer, and you know he's a lawyer, because he asked a further question. He asked for further clarification. He asked the question, and who is my neighbor? That feels like such a slimy question, doesn't it? What a just jerk to ask this sort of question. But let's be honest, like, the word neighbor kind of has some certain connotations for us, doesn't it? Usually when we think of the word neighbor, and I'm inclined to think that this is what they thought back in the first century as well, we think the word neighbor as somebody who lives in close proximity to us, right? Somebody who's next door, somebody who's down the street, somebody who's on the same block. We might refer to that particular person as a neighbor. And so maybe this guy is asking this as more of a clarification I have to be from somebody before they're no longer my neighbor, right? What's the range here? And so he asked this question about, well, who is my neighbor? And Jesus launches into this story. He decides to tell a parable in order to explain who a person's neighbor is. I don't think he expected the answer that he got, though, because Jesus tells him the story that goes on starting in verse 30. He replies, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead." Now, we've mentioned a few times here before that some of the terrain, especially around the city of Jericho, was very rough and rocky and rigid, and the roads weren't exactly straight. There was a lot of twists and turns and cliffs and curves and cracks and crevices and caves, and I only practiced that like 40 times before today. There's all sorts of different areas, and it would be fairly common that if you didn't travel in a group, that oftentimes robbers and bandits and ne'er-do-wells would attack you. Easy hiding spaces, easy to get away, all sorts of places where they could lie in wait, and you wouldn't even know they were there until they are on you. And so when Jesus starts off his narrative talking about this, the audience that's there recognizes that the road that takes you from Jerusalem to Jericho is maybe the worst off on. And so they would have heard a man went from Jericho or from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he got beat and he was half dead, and they would have gone, ugh. Some of them might have even muttered, well, that's what you do when you go there alone. But all of them would have understood that, yeah, this is exactly how that scenario goes. This is a relatable story for them. And when Jesus continues on the narrative, the audience that's there probably assumes that the hero has entered the story, because he says, now by chance, a priest was going down that road. At this point, everybody who's in that audience would assume, okay, this guy's going to be fine. A priest has shown up. He's on the job. He's going to be here. They would have even thought the same thing when Jesus mentioned a Levite coming afterwards, because both priests and Levites were charged with ministering to the people of Israel. Their whole responsibility in life was to take care of the people of Israel, to see to their spiritual needs, certainly, the kind of people that would help out with their physical needs as well. And so when Jesus would continue on to say that both the priest and the Levite saw the man and passed by on the other side, that would have been shocking. If we were to give this kind of a more modern connotation, we could say in place of a priest, we could put a pastor. A pastor happened to be walking down that, this man hurt, and said, I don't want to deal with that, and passed by on the other side. Maybe instead of a Levite, we could say a doctor who's taken the Hippocratic oath to do no harm, to help where there's problems, saw this man, looked around and realized nobody else is there. I'm off the clock. This would have been absolutely stunning to the audience to hear this, that both a priest and a Levite are just leaving this guy here. But when Jesus would mention the Samaritan, the whole vibe in that crowd would change entirely. We're so familiar with this narrative that when we hear the word Samaritan, we don't really think that much about it. We just kind of hear that word and move on, right? But understand, that first audience, they weren't moving on from that word. During the Babylonian captivity, which we've discussed a couple of different times here, several of the Israelites were taken from their homes and put into the service of the Babylonians, hence the name Babylonian captivity. Sometimes it's just right there. But here's the thing, not all of the Israelites were taken. In fact, if you go back into the Old Testament before there and you read about it, it's a remnant remained. And that remnant now suddenly found themselves without a whole lot of population. And if you've got a significantly lighter population than what you had 10 minutes ago, that's going to create some issues. Because eventually your kids are going to grow up. And they're going to want to do things like get married. Well, now the population of available people for them to marry has dwindled. And so a lot of the surrounding nations, they approached some of these remnant of Israelites and they said, hey, why don't you take our daughters and have them in marriage? And why don't you give us some of your daughters and we'll take them in marriage and we'll get through this together. Bear in mind that the Israelites were in the Babylonian captivity for 70 years. And 70 years is a real long time. I know Ray disagrees with that, but I love you, buddy. But 70 years is a long time. And so eventually these people, they started intermarriations. And there's nothing inherently wrong with marrying somebody who comes from a different place than you. But the problem came because these other nations that would intermarry with them, well, they all worshiped other gods. They worshiped false idols. They worshiped just all sorts of other things, and they had different religious practices in worship to those particular gods. And as they married these Israelite people, the nation established by the one true God, well, then all of a sudden those religious practices also got intermixed. And practicing pagan, idolatrous religious practices. After 70 years, when the Israelites who were in Babylon, who had experienced a huge spiritual revival and a renewed commitment to the God of the Israelite people, when they were allowed to go back and rebuild Jerusalem and rebuild the walls around the city and do all kinds of great stuff in the name of God. And if you go back and you look at the Old Testament, they started with the temple. And when they did that, they were so excited and so on fire for this God. And all of a sudden, those Israelites that were left behind that had intermarried and how had intertwined religious practices, well, they came up and said, hey guys, can we help? But why did the Babylonian captivity get started in the first place? Because the Israelites had worshipped idols. And so those who had been in Babylon, who had experienced this huge spiritual reawakening and this renewed commitment to God, they saw these guys who were practicing idols, and they said, I don't want any part of that. I don't want to be anywhere near this. Go away. Over the course of time, those who were that remnant who intermarried, who kind of took on those idol worship practices, they got their own little patch of land called Samaria. Samaria is in kind of the middle of the entire nation of Israel at this time. There's Galilee in the north. There's Judea in the south. In fact, I got a map up here to show you. I like it. They even put Samaria in red for me. I appreciate that. They had this own little patch of land. This was their own little spot. This was where they could be on their own. And they set up their own temple and their own religious practices, and they had all of their own things. But the Israelites who had been in Babylonian captivity and came back and who had settled in Galilee and in Judea, they didn't want anything to do with the Samaritans. They considered them to be. The disdain for Samaritans grew over time. They looked at them as lesser. They began to see them as subhuman. The only time a self-respecting Jewish man would have any interaction with a Samaritan was if there was money to be made. And even then, you did your business and you left. It was so bad. The disdain for Samaritans was so bad that if you lived in Nazareth and you had any reason to go to Jerusalem or Jericho, rather than take the most direct route, which if you know anything about travel is always a straight line, they would walk around Samaria. They would purposefully add days to their journey because they didn't want to be caught dead in the land of the half-breeds. And so when Jesus says, but a Samaritan, that first century audience, some of them would probably start booing. They would hiss. They would recoil in disgust because the idea that a Samaritan could be the hero of this story, that's just ridiculous. That's absurd. That's unheard of. We're not going to listen to that. There's no good thing that could happen when a Samaritan is around. Samaritans are no good. They're untrustworthy. They're lower than dogs. And yet, in this parable, Jesus tells of a Samaritan who, when he saw him, had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring oil and wine. He set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, take care of him, and whatever you pay you when I come back. This hated Samaritan is not only the hero who helped this stranger in his hour of need, but went above and beyond it and saw that his needs were met beyond this. Understand, when it says that he gave him 2 denarii, when he gave the innkeeper 2 denarii, a denarii was a day's wages for a day laborer. If you worked a full day, and they didn't go 9 to 5, they went sun up to sundown. If you worked that whole day, you would be paid 1 denarii. That is an insane amount of money to give to an innkeeper to take care of this stranger who you don't know. You've tended to his wounds. You took him to the inn in the first place to see to further care. You'd done enough. And yet this Samaritan says, that's not enough. I'm going to take care of his needs beyond this. He not only helped someone in the hour of their need, he went above and beyond it. And here's the thing, and we cannot miss this. If their roles were reversed, well, that guy would have just walked on past that Samaritan. Because Samaritans aren't worth your time. Samaritans aren't the kind of people that you would want to go and help out. And so the idea that a Samaritan would not only step in to somebody who would not do the same for him, somebody who probably hated him for no other reason than where he was born, or what he looked like, or the way that he practiced, or the way that he lived his life. The idea that this Samaritan would be the hero of the story is crazy. This would have been shocking. It would have been borderline scandalous. In fact, and I doubt you've ever noticed this before, because I didn't notice it for a long time, really, until, I think, Friday. I called Mandy as soon as I realized it. It's like, this is so cool. I never picked up on this. And after I talked to Mandy, I talked to my buddy Beef, who you're going to meet in a couple of weeks. Yeah. And I told Beef, don't ask about the nickname. The story is not nearly as cool as the nickname itself. I said, Beef, you got to hear about this. And he thought it was cool too, because we're Bible nerds. But when Jesus says to that man, so who is the neighbor to the man beaten? The guy's answer in the first part of verse 37 is the one who showed him mercy. He couldn't even bring himself to say the word Samaritan. It'd have been much more concise, right? Who was the neighbor? The Samaritan. But the idea that a Samaritan is the hero of the story is so surprising and so unexpected and so ludicrous that he can't even say it. Well, the one who showed him mercy. That's who the neighbor is. Again, had the roles been reversed, there's no way that guy would have stopped for a Samaritan. In the eyes of the Jews at this particular point in time, there was no such thing as a good Samaritan. But what makes this act of service, that's what makes this act of service so unexpected. And Jesus says in the rest of that verse, you go and do likewise. If it had been the priest or the Levite who stopped to help this man out, it's a good story, but I don't think it's one that's well remembered. I don't even think it makes the book. Don't get me wrong, it'd have been nice if it had been the priest or the Levite to stop there, and I don't think that Jesus was trying to say that had the priest or the Levite been the ones to stop and help him out, that would have been a bad thing. But that would have been expected. None of that would have been surprising. The idea that Jesus would make a Samaritan the hero of the story and his heroics simply being taking care of somebody who otherwise would have despised him and rejected him and had nothing to do with him is what makes this story so captivating that even those outside of the walls of the church, many who have never even been to a church, are at least aware of the story of the Good Samaritan. When service is done in unexpected ways and for unexpected people, that is bound to stand out. The call of Christian service is not just a call to take care of other Christians. That's nice, and we absolutely should be doing that. But the real call, and what makes the way that Jesus called us to serve so challenging, is that we are called to serve those who otherwise would have nothing to do. We are called to go and to serve those who hate us, who despise us. And yet loving and serving those who would otherwise call us enemies is such a dominant theme in the teachings of Jesus. He says in Matthew chapter 5, verses 46 and 47, "For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same?" It's a nice thing to serve those who love us and that we love in return. I don't think Jesus is saying that's a bad thing to do. But how is that any different than the way the world expects things to go? If we just serve those who we know love us and would do the same for us in return, that's nice. But what does it actually do? As Christians, we are called to demonstrate the love of Jesus Christ and to serve generously those who otherwise would reject us and hate us. We are called to love those through service, those who hate us, who look differently than us, who live differently than us, who vote differently than us, whose entire existence is different than ours. We are called to love and to serve atheists, Muslim extremists, Republicans, Democrats, gays, lesbians, KJV, fundamentalists, Michigan fans, and anybody else who might look at us as their enemy. Serving those who are just like us is nice. Serving those who hate us, serving in unexpected ways, can change everything. Because it completely disrupts the norm. It completely upsets the apple cart. It completely changes the way that people view you. To serve in such a generous and loving and compassionate way to somebody who would not do the same for you, that's when we demonstrate the love of Jesus Christ. Because that's what he did for us. To willingly sacrifice and serve everything so that you and I could have a chance at redemption. When we did not deserve it, when we've given him every reason why we're not worthy of it, he did it anyway. Which of these three do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? He said, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said to him, you go and do likewise.